Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to unpack how a rapid-fire series of actions and reactions morphed a pretty simple tax dispute into the literal explosive birth of the United States. If you've ever wondered how a bunch of scattered, bickering colonies managed to band together and take on the greatest empire on Earth, well, you're in the exact right place. Let's get into it.
So how exactly did a tax cut on tea spark the birth of a nation? It's wild, right? Because as we're going to see, the Declaration of Independence was absolutely not some inevitable foregone conclusion. It was the result of a ticking time bomb, a massive mix of tensions, misunderstandings, and just fierce ideological battles. And the ultimate irony, this whole thing really kicks into high gear, not with a tax hike, but yeah, a tax cut.
Section 1. The Tea Act Spark. Believe it or not, this entire powder keg started with a massive economic crisis thousands of miles away over in Britain. 15 million. That is how many pounds of unsold tea the British East India Company was just sitting on in 1773. They were completely drowning in debt. So, to prevent this giant corporation from totally going under, the British Parliament steps in to bail them out, passing what we know as the Tea Act. Basically, this allowed the company to sell its tea directly to the colonies without paying the usual London export taxes. Now, the sheer irony here is that the Tea Act actually lowered the cost of tea for the average colonist. You'd think cheaper goods would make people thrilled, right? But no, the colonists resisted, and they resisted strictly on principle. They looked at this unexpectedly cheap tea and saw a Trojan horse. They figured Prime Minister Lord North was pulling a fast one, trying to trick them into paying a small duty once the tea was unloaded. And if they paid that duty, well, they felt they'd be implicitly agreeing that Parliament had the right to tax them without their consent. For the colonists, no taxation without representation wasn't just a catchy slogan. They saw this as a sneaky scheme to establish a dangerous precedent for future, much more punishing taxes.
And this principled resistance escalated fast. Up in Boston, when the tea ships refused to turn around and leave, a group of men disguised as Mohawks marched right down to the wharf. In under 4 hours, they dumped 342 chests of tea straight into the harbor. And interestingly, they meticulously avoided damaging any other property. But the single massive act of defiance, it triggered an absolute cascade. Emboldened patriots down in Charleston, over in Philadelphia, and up in New York quickly followed suit. Throughout 1773 and 1774, these boycotts and copycat tea parties spread like wildfire across the continent, firmly uniting the colonists in this massive consumer rebellion.
Section 2. The Intolerable Crackdown.
As you might expect, Parliament's response to all this destruction of corporate property was swift and it was severe. Britain slammed down what they called the Coercive Acts, which the colonists almost immediately branded the Intolerable Acts. This was a stark, uncompromising checklist of punishments meant to crush the rebellion once and for all. They financially choked Boston by completely closing its port. They stripped away local governance by dissolving the Massachusetts Assembly. They even shielded royal officials from local trials with the Administration of Justice Act, and passed a new quartering act allowing the British Army to house soldiers right inside colonists' private homes. The Crown really thought this heavy-handed approach would isolate Massachusetts and basically terrify the rest of the colonies into submission.
But spoiler alert, instead of isolating Massachusetts, this crackdown spectacularly backfired. It actually brought the colonies closer together. Fearing they were next on the chopping block, colonial delegates formed the First Continental Congress, which led to a massive shift in how things were run. They passed the Continental Association. Now, this wasn't just some strongly worded piece of paper. It deputized local committees to enforce strict boycotts, which effectively empowered everyday common citizens to wield real, on-the-ground political power. Women, for example, who made the household purchasing decisions, were absolutely crucial here. 51 women in Edenton, North Carolina even signed a highly visible public agreement to support the boycotts. The resistance was no longer just a parlor game for elite politicians. Suddenly, everybody had a role to play.
Section 3. First Blood in Massachusetts.
So you have this fierce economic and political standoff, and obviously, it just couldn't stay peaceful forever. By the spring of 1775, things completely boiled over. On April 19th, British regiments marched out to seize militia weapons stashed in Lexington and Concord. But the colonists knew they were coming. Local militiamen, the famous Minutemen, met the British right out on Lexington Green. A shot rang out. To this day, nobody knows exactly who fired it, but it triggered a devastating volley from the British. These were the very first fatal shots of the war. After that, the Minutemen actually chased the British forces all the way back to Boston, effectively trapping them and kicking off a massive colonial siege of the city with some 20,000 militiamen. The war was officially on.
Now, while blood is literally being shed up in Massachusetts, down in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress is meeting.
and they are deeply, deeply divided. On one hand, you've got the radicals. Guys like John and Samuel Adams and Richard Henry Lee, they are pounding the table, demanding full military backing and supplies for the men laying siege to Boston. But on the flip side, you have the moderates, like John and Edward Rutledge. They are absolutely terrified of a full-scale war with the mother country and are desperately calling for renewed attempts at peaceful reconciliation. This intense internal division forced Congress to strike, honestly, a pretty bizarre compromise. They agreed to officially adopt the Massachusetts militia as the brand new Continental Army, and they named George Washington as its commander. So they are literally raising a formal army. But at the exact same time, to appease those moderates, they drafted what's known as the Olive Branch Petition. In it, they're directly assuring the king that they, quote, most ardently desire the former harmony between Britain and the colonies. It's wild. They're simultaneously gearing up for all-out war while begging for peace.
But here we run into a total, catastrophic communication breakdown across the Atlantic. Because before that peaceful Olive Branch Petition even lands in London, King George III issues a fierce proclamation of his own. He basically says, nope, the colonists are, quote, traitorously preparing, ordering, and levying war against us. He officially declared the colonies to be an open, armed rebellion. So any sliver of hope for a peaceful reconciliation slammed shut by the king himself.
Section 4. The Tipping Point.
With peace officially tossed out the window by the Crown, the colonies hit a massive tipping point. The debate over what to do next wasn't just confined to the stuffy halls of Congress anymore, it was echoing through the streets and the local taverns. And a huge reason for that was a brilliant 46-page pamphlet called Common Sense. It was penned by Thomas Paine, who was actually a recent English immigrant. Paine used this fiery, super-accessible language to just openly trash the idea of a monarchy. He bluntly pointed out the sheer geographical absurdity of the whole setup, writing, "There is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island." It was a total game changer. It created a massive ideological shift that suddenly made the radical concept of total independence palatable and actually popular for the everyday colonist.
Meanwhile, right at the same time, a very different, highly practical crisis was erupting down in the South. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, declares martial law. But he goes a step further and issues a proclamation offering freedom to any enslaved people who leave their patriot enslavers and join the British Army. This was monumental. We're talking about the first mass emancipation of enslaved people in American history. And thousands eventually did flock to the British lines, risking absolutely everything for a shot at freedom.
Now, the crucial thing to understand here is the massive disconnect between the British motives and the colonial reaction. From the British side, offering this freedom was strictly a practical military tactic, a way to disrupt the patriot economy and quickly swell their own ranks. But for the white Southern enslavers, it was utterly unnerving. It sparked intense paranoia and a deep fear of uprisings. And in this incredibly dark twist of irony, this British military tactic actually pushed a lot of previously moderate Southerners straight toward the radical idea of independence, simply as a way to protect the institution of slavery from British interference. The pressure cooker was literally about to burst.
Section 5. Declaring Independence.
So you've got this incredible pressure mounting from all sides. There's escalating military conflict up north, fiery ideological pamphlets sweeping through the middle colonies, and severe social upheaval down south. All of this forced the final irreversible break. On June 7, 1776, a resolution for full independence was formally introduced to Congress. Knowing it was going to pass, they tasked a specific drafting committee, featuring heavy hitters like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin, to put together a formal public announcement. Jefferson ended up doing the heavy lifting on the initial draft, while Adams and Franklin provided some really crucial edits. They knew they needed a document that would clearly articulate to the entire world exactly why they were taking this unprecedented leap.
And the result, officially approved on July 4, 1776, was the Declaration of Independence. What makes this document so legendary isn't just that it declared a split, it's how it framed the argument. The committee deliberately bypassed all the standard technical legal arguments about British constitutional rights. Instead, Jefferson grounded that famous preamble in the bold, universal assertion of natural law. He wrote that all men are endowed with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that when a government becomes destructive to those ends, the people have a fundamental right to alter or abolish it. This wasn't just a laundry list of tax complaints anymore. It was a profound philosophical statement of human rights.
As fresh copies of the document were printed and read aloud in town squares across the colonies, a decade of pent-up resistance erupted into immediate physical action. I mean, just look at what happened on July 9th, 1776. Barely days after the Declaration was signed, a fired-up mob in New York City literally pulled down a massive gilded lead statue of King George III. It was such a highly symbolic, visceral act. They were physically tearing down the image of the monarch they once revered, permanently severing their ties to the empire.
It is wild to look back and see how rapidly these 13 colonies went from just resisting a corporate tea monopoly to forging a brand new independent nation. It was driven by this incredibly complex mix of high-minded ideals and very harsh on-the-ground realities. But I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. Declaring independence on a piece of parchment was one thing, but they had just picked a fight with the wealthiest, most powerful military machine on the face of the earth. The ink was dry, but the war was really just beginning. Could this fractured, newly formed alliance actually pull it off and win? Well, that is a massive question for another day. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep exploring.